In September of 1985, a man drove out of the Apple computer campus in Cupertino for what he believed might be the last time. He had co-founded the company 9 years earlier. He had built it from a garage into a corporation worth $2 billion. He had recruited the executives, designed the products, and sold a vision with ferocity that no one else in the industry could match. And now the board of directors, at the urging of the CEO he himself had brought in to run the company, had stripped him of all operational responsibilities and made his continued presence at Apple functionally impossible. His name was Steve Jobs. He was 30 years old, and the men who had pushed him out were already making plans for a future without him. What they could not have known, what no one could have known in September 1985, was that their decision would eventually cost them control of the most important computer company of the next 2 decades, and that the man they had pushed out would return, not as a supplicant, not as a consultant, but as the only person capable of saving the company they had nearly destroyed without him. To understand why the Apple board removed Steve Jobs, you need to understand what Apple was in 1985, and you need to understand what Steve Jobs was like to work with in 1985. The company had been phenomenally successful. The Apple II had made it rich. The Macintosh, Jobs' obsession, his personal project, the machine he had willed into existence through a combination of genius and terror, had launched in January 1984 to enormous cultural impact. It had not, however, been the commercial success Jobs had promised. The Mac was too slow, too expensive, too limited in memory. Sales were disappointing. The division was in trouble, and Jobs, who had a way of responding to adversity by becoming more intense, more demanding, and more difficult, was not making the situation easier to manage. He had hired John Sculley from PepsiCo in 1983 with a famous pitch. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley had come. And then, in the spring and summer of 1985, Sculley and the board decided that what Apple needed was not a founder with vision, but a manager with a plan. They restructured the company. They removed Jobs from any operational role. They essentially made it impossible for him to continue. Jobs resigned in September of 1985 and sold all but one of his Apple shares. He was done. He spent the next 11 years building 2 things that most people at the time considered failures or at best curiosities. The first was Next Computer, a workstation company that made strikingly beautiful and impossibly expensive computers for educational and scientific markets. Next never achieved significant commercial success. It burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. It produced a handful of innovative products and never broke into the mainstream. By most measures, as a standalone company, it was a disappointment. The second thing Jobs built was something he acquired rather than created. In 1986, he bought a small computer graphics division from George Lucas for $5 million. The division had about 40 employees and one interesting product, a computer called the Pixar image computer. Jobs spent years funding the company, losing money consistently, and watching his investment shrink before the company pivoted to making short computer-animated films for Pixar's demo reel. The first full-length film Pixar made, released in 1995, was called Toy Story. It was the highest-grossing film of the year. It was the first entirely computer-animated feature film in history. It made Pixar a publicly traded company with a market capitalization on its first day of trading of approximately $1.5 billion. Jobs owned roughly 80% of Pixar at that point. He was a billionaire before he ever returned to Apple. This is the detail that changes the nature of the Apple story entirely. Jobs did not return to Apple as a desperate man. He returned as someone who had already won, who had already proved, in the clearest possible terms, that his vision for future computing and entertainment was correct, and that the people who had pushed him out had been wrong. Apple, meanwhile, had spent 11 years making a series of decisions that suggested the company had fundamentally lost its way without the one person who understood what made Apple Apple. The company had released dozens of products that no one wanted, including a personal digital assistant called the Newton that became a cultural symbol of corporate hubris. It had lost market share consistently to Microsoft. It had burned through CEOs. Its stock was near historic lows. In 1996, Gil Amelio, Apple's latest CEO, made the decision to acquire Next Computer for $429 million. The stated reason was that Apple needed a new operating system, and Next had one. The actual result was that Steve Jobs walked back into building. Within months, Emilio was gone. Jobs was named interim CEO, a title he retained for years, almost as a private joke about the permanence of temporary arrangements. What he did over the following 3 years is one of the most documented corporate turnarounds in history. He cut Apple's product line from dozens of products to 4. He ended the clone licensing program that had allowed other manufacturers to make Mac-compatible computers. He signed a landmark agreement with Microsoft that brought a $150 million investment and guaranteed Office for Mac, a deal that was booed at the Macworld audience when Jobs announced it. And that was essential to Apple's survival. He brought Jonathan Ive into the foreground and made design Apple's defining competitive advantage. He launched the iMac in 1998, the first genuinely beautiful mass-market personal computer since the original Macintosh. It sold 1 million units in its first year. Then he launched the iPod, then the iTunes Store, then the iPhone, then the iPad, and then in 2011, the year he died, Apple briefly became the most valuable publicly traded company in the history of the world, worth more than ExxonMobil, more than Microsoft, more than any company that had ever existed. John Sculley, the man who had orchestrated his removal from Apple in 1985, became a speaker and consultant. He has given hundreds of interviews over the years discussing his time at Apple, his relationship with Jobs, and what he wishes had been different. He has never fully answered the one question that matters. What would Apple have become if he had not pushed Jobs out? The answer, of course, is unknowable, but the comparison is not. Apple without Jobs from 1985 to 1997 produced nothing that changed the world. Apple with Jobs from 1997 to 2011 produced the iPhone, the iPad, the iPod, iTunes, the App Store, Pixar, and market capitalization that made the most valuable company in human history. The board that fired Steve Jobs in 1985 thought they were removing a problem. They were removing the only person who understood what the company was supposed to become. The 12 years between the firing and the return were not a punishment for Jobs. They were a preparation. He came back richer, more experienced, less willing to tolerate interference, and with a clarity of vision that the intervening years of failure and success had sharpened to an edge that nothing at Apple in 1985 could have produced. They didn't fire a difficult employee. They accidentally built the most powerful version of the person who would save them. Subscribe to The Reckoning. Every Tuesday, the true story behind the empires the world thinks it already understands. Next week, 2 brothers, 1 shoe factory. A feud so bitter, it divided an entire German town for 60 years. The true story of how Adidas and Puma were both born from a single act of family betrayal. Subscribe, hit the bell,